All right. So the sending out of the 12 begins here. These 12, this is Matthew 10, 5 and following. These 12, Jesus sent out with the following instructions: do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans, and go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. Why would Jesus tell his disciples to stay away from what we would call outreach or evangelism? Brad?
He wanted to reach the people of Israel first.
Yeah. I also think that you have this issue with regard to Israel, that they've been waiting for the Savior to come, and Jesus wanted them to know, first and foremost, that he had come. That's who he had come for. And so let's take care of that first, and then we'll reach out to others. It's just, if you can put yourself into this context, it's only going to be a couple of years. Let's go to Israel first, and then, wait until Paul shows up, and then we'll get to the Gentiles. But let's do this first, and then we'll move out, we'll move on. First the lost sheep of Israel. And then he gives them this message. So as you go, preach this message: the kingdom of heaven is near. When you hear that, I forget if I asked about this on the handout, but what do you think of when you hear kingdom of heaven? To a certain extent, the judgment day and after. Although it is also about this lifetime, it can be. But the near is what kind of puts us into judgment day, doesn't it? The end is near, the end is at hand, the kingdom is near. When Jesus talks about the kingdom, what's he often talking about? Well, in his parables, he will often say, the kingdom of heaven is like. And then he'll talk about what? A woman sweeping out her kitchen to find a coin. You looking for a lost sheep. A dad who had a deadbeat son who shows up on the doorstep again. Different things like that. So the kingdom of heaven is also gathering the repentant, finding the lost. And the finding of the lost is near also works for this passage. So it's the way that it can be kind of three things. So the way that God gathers people into the church in general, it can be the faith we have personally in our own hearts, and then the judgment as well, all of these things. So then he says, heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons, freely you have received, freely give. So what was to set these disciples apart from other traveling teachers, traveling rabbis, or just people with strong opinions who are walking around? Well, the miracles will attest to the message. So he gives them the basic message, the kingdom of heaven, and then he says, do these things. And so healing the sick would be pretty amazing. People would look up and take notice if he did that. Then he raises the dead. That we talked about that last time. Only 5 people in the Bible raised the dead personally. How about a little quiz? You remember who the 5 are? Elijah, Elisha, Jesus, wow, Peter and Paul. Very well done. I'm proud. The little what is it? The little green owl would wave at you in the. I'm learning a new language through. Is it called Duolingo? This is not a commercial for that, but the little owl waves when you get it right. It's pretty cool. So very nicely done. But raising the dead would be quite spectacular, but equally spectacular, cleanse those who have leprosy. Nobody could do that, but Jesus tells his disciples to do it, and drive out demons. Nobody could do that either. And Jesus tells his disciples to go ahead and do it. Freely you have received, freely give. Brad. couple of them. He has raised the daughter of Jairus. He has driven out a demon. He has healed a leper. He's done all of these so far, just in this chapter and in the previous chapter, most of them. So he's done all of them. The disciples know that he's done it simply by saying, do it. And they're now going to do the same thing generally by saying, in the name of Jesus Christ, I command you, be clean, rise, be healed, get out, or whatever it is that he's going to say. Yeah.
So then that would connect the disciples with Jesus and his message, people seeing them perform those miracles, and having either heard about or seen Jesus doing the same thing. Well,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, the connection gets made. I would imagine that the news about these miracles that Jesus has done is everywhere, faster than much of our news even travels practically today. And because if they've done these things, then what, and now these other guys are doing it too. This is the message to listen to. Yeah. And now with regard to their preparations, this is where he goes next. Do not take along any gold or silver or copper in your belts. And that kind of diminishes. So gold, the most valuable coin or whatever. Silver, considerably less valuable than gold, right? The same item in silver is worth an awful lot less than the same item in gold. And then copper, or brass, practically valueless. And, if it's a coin or something like that, what would that be worth? So very, very little, but don't take any of it. Don't take a lot, don't take quite a bit, don't take even a tiny bit. Don't take anything, you're not going to need it. Take no bag for the journey, or extra tunic, that'd be like an extra shirt, or extra sandals, or a staff. For the worker is worth his keep. So he's telling them, I'm sending you out now. Don't go home for anything. Basically, if you don't have it with you, don't go get it. Some of you have everything you need. Some of you act like you don't have everything you want. Just go. You'll be fine. People will take care of you as you go. And then he says, for the worker is worth his keep. Now, this verse is almost the same in Luke, I think it's Luke 10:35, and what he says there is the worker is worth his wages. Very, very similar. And the reason I make a point of that is that this is one of the key verses in confirming what is New Testament and what is not. So, now, forget I said that for a second. And imagine for a moment that you're alive at this time, or shortly after, like let's say it's the year 101 AD. You're just walking home from the Apostle John's funeral. You heard a great sermon from some guy named, I don't know, Ignatius or something. And he had a really cool thing. The Apostles' Creed, he called it, at the end of the funeral. But nobody had ever heard that before. I'm just making stuff up here. And a new kind of music called a hymn. And anyway, you're walking home, and you're talking about this, and then some people are saying, wouldn't it be great if we had stories about Jesus or instructions from the apostles that we could talk about in church? And my question is, you've known Genesis to Malachi your whole life, and now there are other documents around, and people are beginning to wonder, are some of these part of God's word also or not? What's your criterion for what's in the Bible and what isn't in the Bible? This morning, the ladies and a couple gentlemen got really deep into they hoped theologically correct answers, but I'm just asking what your opinion might be about this stuff. Any idea? I kind of wonder if people would say, well, first of all, was it at least written by an apostle? Would that be a valuable benchmark? Written by so what in the New Testament is written by an apostle? And I mean the 12. Matthew, John, and John's letters. And John's 3 letters are really kind of about church fellowship. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John are tests for, are we in fellowship with other church bodies? And then Revelation. Peter wrote a couple things. Yeah, Peter wrote a couple letters. One of them's about false teachers. And then, if we go from there, in one of Peter's letters, Peter says, read and share the writings of Paul and treat them as you do the other scriptures. Aha! Now, by including Peter, we've just elevated Paul, because Peter says that about Paul. So now all of a sudden, we've got a whole bunch more, 13 or 14 more chunks of the New Testament. Are you following? Just kind of tracking? And by the way, also with regard to adding Peter, the opinion of the earliest church was that the church wanted Peter to write a gospel, and Peter never would. And after Peter died, they got his companion Mark to write down the story of Jesus just based on Peter's preaching with no additions. And that's really kind of the Gospel of Mark that we have. And I've never found anything that really contradicts that. And we pretty much still accept that today, that's probably Mark wrote down not his own eyewitness, but what Peter said in his preaching as Mark was going around with Peter. And that's why Mark doesn't have certain things like there's no birth account of Jesus and so forth. But just that stuff. So what do we have now? By saying those things, Matthew, Mark, John, Romans, all the way down to Philemon and maybe Hebrews, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelation. What are we missing? Well, now we come to another piece, because in his letters, Paul, who was affirmed by Peter, Paul, in one of the Timothys, affirms Luke through this verse, or rather the other version of this verse. The worker deserves his wages. That's Luke's expression. And it's unusual enough and different enough from Matthew that we know that Paul in 1 Timothy is quoting Luke, which elevates Luke also. And by the way, not only Luke, but what's Luke's gospel's companion piece? Acts. Now we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, probably Hebrews, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Revelation. I skipped only 2. What were they? James and Jude. And those are by the brothers of Jesus. In fact, Jude is really a rehash of 2 Peter chapter 2. Peter says, watch out, false teachers are coming. And Jude says, watch out, false teachers have come. So it's really just taking that one chapter of 2 Peter and saying, yeah, this is all taking place. And nobody contested the book of James in the ancient church. It was not spoken against. So there's your New Testament for you, basically. Now, having said that, why then was, say, the gospel of, somebody name a false gospel that you've heard of? Gospel of Thomas. Why? I'll put it the way that my sister-in-law puts it, a great opponent of New Testament scholarship. Why did they leave the Gospel of Thomas out of the Bible? Well, yesterday was 4th of July. Let me put it this way. Why didn't the founding fathers quote, say, FDR or John F. Kennedy or the Gipper in the Constitution? It hadn't been written yet. Yeah, none of that had happened yet. So why wasn't the Gospel of Thomas included in the first, second, third, fourth century copy of the New Testament, because the Gospel of Thomas wasn't written until the late 4th century. And it was written in Egypt and in Coptic. And it's got weird things in it. Oh, I don't know if any of you have ever actually seen a copy of the Gospel of Thomas. It was my first translation project in the language of Coptic. But have you seen it?
I saw one of Sarah's nurses had a tattoo from the Gospel of Thomas.
Really? At home, my wife had a flip calendar from, remember in the old days, the Aid Association for Lutherans? Those of us who are younger people are like, what? Yeah. Say that again? Yeah, they did. Yeah. AAL used to make a flip calendar of Bible verses, like new day, new picture, new passage, like that. And Kath actually reused them constantly. She had one in like a couple of them in different rooms in the house. I think we still have it out in the kitchen, although the cats usually knock it over. But anyway, that's what the Gospel of Thomas is. The verses don't connect one to the other. It's just a flip calendar of passages, almost like you took a gospel, cut up some of the interesting verses and just stuck them in like that. That's what the Gospel of Thomas is. Yeah, it's not really a connection, it's more of a collection of like Proverbs is, kind of like that. And quite late. And there's a bizarre chunk of false doctrine right in the middle of the Gospel of Thomas, and no, I'm not going to go into it right now. But very, very strange. So anyway, that's this verse, Matthew 10:10, or Luke, what did I say? It's about 10:35, something like that. Okay, let's go on with verse 11. So Jesus still giving marching orders to the apostles. Whenever you enter a town or village, find out who is worthy and stay there until you leave. As you enter the household, give it your greeting. So how would they find out who is worthy? Some of the folks this morning kind of wondered if the worthy people would naturally walk out to greet the apostles. How would they know they were coming, though? I'm thinking that most people would be, like out milking the goat or repairing the roof or just hoeing the garden or making bread or whatever that day, or scaling fish, or any of the delightful things that all the people did in those days. I don't think they would have known that the apostles had shown up until the apostles started talking to people, going into the square of the city, talking to people, and then eventually that first day, by the time evening came, somebody would have probably said, do you have a place to stay? Would you like to stay in our home? We have a nice roof. You can walk up there and lay down your bedrolls, and if you don't have bedrolls, we've got extra. So that's kind of what I think. Find out who is worthy. Find out who would offer you a place. Of course, what if you found out that the person who offered you a place was, kind of a Schweinhund? What am I trying to say? Not such a worthy person. Well, I think the disciples would probably just endure it to a certain extent. Jesus does say this, and forgive the yellow highlight, if the household is worthy, let your peace rest on it, but if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. But Jesus doesn't say necessarily leave the house, but stay there. But on the other hand, your blessing isn't on that house any longer if they're sort of opponents to your message or what have you. Or if they're not letting their gospel light shine. Sometimes people we call them nominal Christians because they're Christians in name only. That's often said of, who wrote the famous oratorio, The Messiah? Handel, George Frederick Handel, right? Did you know that he was nominally Lutheran? He's one of those composers. I don't like to use them when I say Beethoven, Bach, Brahms, Buxtehude, the great Lutheran composers, but often Handel gets stuck in there because, at least by name, by baptism, he was a Lutheran, but he spent most of his life in England, and I think probably became an Anglican, and was Anglican in his theology, at least later on, or it seems to be anyway. But so if they were nominally Christian, but they didn't behave like Christians, what if you go into the house and they're sitting down the meal and they all have filthy mouths, and they giggle when the kids swear at the table and stuff that people do and everything, and they're just wretched people, and you just kind of don't want to be there. Well, Jesus says, stay there, but let your peace return to you. Don't bless the house when you leave. So, and he says, if anyone does not receive you or listen to your words, shake the dust off your feet as you leave that house or that town. So when you do leave the house, shake the dust off. And when you do leave that town, if it's the whole town, shake the dust off. Amen, I tell you, it will be more bearable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. So let's walk that idea through. Sodom and Gomorrah, what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah? Destroyed by what? Was it a tsunami? Fire. Something like lava, or whatever brimstone is if it's not lava, raining down from the sky and wiping the city out, killing all of the people in the city. Terrible destruction. Mark. How is that different from lava? So, horrifying. Terrible destruction. Thank you. Terrible, terrible, terrible destruction. And why were Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed this way? Unrepentant sexual sins. Yeah. They were guilty of all kinds of things. We see in the text in Genesis, there was an attempted, how do I put this? An attempted homosexual gang rape is what they were trying to do when the angels pulled Lot back inside the door and so forth. And then the next morning they fled, and so they were wiped out. And Jesus is now saying, if a village doesn't accept your gospel message, they're going to have it worse on Judgment Day than Sodom will have it. So what doctrine does that teach us? Degrees of punishment in hell. And there are other passages that teach us degrees of extended blessing in heaven. I'm not so sure about what that all involves. All I know is I'm sure that my sainted wife has a better spot than I will ever have. And that if all of you walk into heaven's door and see me holding the door and taking your shoes, just walk by. If you don't want to, don't even acknowledge that you know me. Just walk by, I'll do my job, and you guys walk into the good seats. I'm fine where I am, because you are fine Christian people and will have wonderful places in heaven. But with regard to degrees of hell, how many of you have at least heard of Dante's Inferno? Okay, almost all of us have heard of Dante's Inferno. I don't know if anybody else has read it, but it's difficult to read because Dante, is it Alighieri? Is that how you pronounce his other name, I think? He wrote it as really a satire of all of the most well-known people of his day. What level of hell is that person in? And on down, and his degrees of hell are rings that as they get lower, they get smaller. So that the worst people are the fewest of at the bottom. It's sort of like an inverted cone, right? So ring, 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 down to the very bottom. And if someone were going to redo Dante's Inferno today, it would be very difficult. But they would have to take all of the celebrities and pop figures of our time. And wow, what level of hell does he or she fit into? And of course, if you're obsessed with World War II, there are plenty of Nazis to fill out the levels of hell. And I would guess that there would be certain ones who would be a little bit lower than others because of things that they did and so forth. Anybody who worked for the Gestapo is going to be a lot lower than anybody who worked for the Luftwaffe, with one exception. That would be Goering himself. So the hard thing about reading Dante is that to understand it, or even pretend to understand it, you have to read all of the footnotes, and your head is just swimming after about 3 pages. Who are all these people? I don't know who they are. But what would somebody think if they had to read the biographies of all of the celebrities and politicians and pop stars of our era, ranked in terms of from bad to worse? And how would you, that'd be a curious endeavor. But Dante does it by sin. So which sins are up high and which sins are down lower? And he does it by peering through the New Testament and the Old. What is the and so what is the first commandment? You shall have no other gods. And those individuals are in their own ring. Who misused God's name, they're in another ring, and so on down. And but finally, in the very bottom, I don't know if it's because of his opinion or what, but what he has at the very bottom are the traitors. Who committed treason? The most famously. And so in Dante's world, before any 21st century politics, who are the most famous traitors of all time? Who? Judas and Brutus are 2 of the 3. And then along with Brutus, who was a traitor to Julius Caesar, was another traitor in the same group, Cassius. So in the bottom ring of hell, Brutus, Cassius, and Judas Iscariot are head first in the mouth of the devil, with their rear ends and their legs sticking out and kicking. And the devil has got them in his mouth, and the devil himself is frozen. So that's the bottom ring of hell in Dante's Inferno. Quite an image. Yeah. That's not what Yana's drawing right now, is it? Okay, just double checking. All righty. I gotta be careful what I say out loud with kids in the room. Okay. Yeah, I know. It's some pretty good Genesis pictures. All right. Anything else there on degrees of heaven, degrees of hell? All right. You've been listening to Invisible Church, the Bible study podcast from St. Paul's Lutheran Church, New Ulm, Minnesota.